I'm here on August 3rd, 2022. I'm David Sutton, and I'm here with my colleague and longtime friend Amy Trubek for the seventh in a series of interviews on the origins and development of food anthropology, sponsored by the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition. And as I say, I'm very happy to be here. I've known Amy for over 20 years now, and we share a lot of common interests and even some common methodologies. So I'm very eager to talk to Amy, and I'm also interested because Amy, you're the first person I'm interviewing in this series, I believe, who really started your career in anthropology as a food anthropologist. I know that you had a background in food service, even going back maybe to high school, and then you worked at the New England Culinary Institute. And so can you tell us a little bit about how you found anthropology and how you thought about getting into the anthropology of food at the time that you did, and what were the steps along that path?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I will say, David, it's great to talk to you. You certainly have been such a guiding light, and always like a little bit ahead and sort of more theoretically sort of informed. And it's been so wonderful to talk to you over the years and read all your work.
Likewise.
So yeah, I guess I do have a story that is maybe not exactly the same as other people's stories. I grew up in an academic environment, mm-hmm. So I think that will make a difference to my story. I went to undergraduate at Haverford College, and I majored in what was a combined sociology anthropology department. And it was three professors of a certain generation, and it was a major, unusually I think for an undergraduate major, that you read a lot of theory. So there was a core course where we read, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Parsons, as like 18 or 19-year-olds. Right. And so I graduated from college knowing about sociology and anthropology, but also knowing a fair amount about higher education environments because I grew up in one. So I think that kind of helps explain some of my decisions. But I, starting in high school, was very interested in cooking as a practice. And in a way, despite the fact that I was not from, and especially in those days, we're talking about the late 70s, to be from a middle-class, highly educated family and being like, what I want to do is work in a restaurant was very unusual. Right. Much different these days. But I started working at this wonderful restaurant in the town that I grew up in. And I also, with a friend, my next door neighbor was a friend of mine, we ran a catering business. And we would do functions for our parents. And because they were all big entertainers. Another really interesting thing is in the 70s, when I was doing this, people had work parties at home a lot. And they would get money from the university or their business, and they would host things at their house. Less and less, that happens less and less, and more people, especially in urban areas, will go to professional restaurants or catering sites. But in those days, that's what you did. So anyway, so I went to college very interested in cooking, having had some experience. Went to college, did the traditional undergraduate bachelor's degree, but every summer I worked in the food business. So, and this was also the days before you were supposed to do these internships in the summer that professionalized you, which is now what you do. Right. So, but I was kind of doing it, but I was going in this direction. So when I graduated from college, I was like, I want to work and really get more into cooking. So I worked as an apprentice in a small French restaurant in Cambridge, Mass. And I think what I realized fairly quickly, probably within a year or so, that I was not going to be the person to do this for the rest of my life because the physical stamina involved. I never had a huge amount of that kind of physical stamina. And I also have never been somebody who likes staying up late at night. And so I did start realizing if I was going to do a lot of professional cooking, I was probably going to do baking because it was something you could do more in the morning. Mm-hmm. But I decided that I really wanted to close out this experience by going to culinary school. So I decided to go to the Cordon Bleu. But I knew that it was kind of an end of a phase, and that what I really wanted to do was become a food writer. So I was reading MFK Fisher and Elizabeth David, and I really just wanted to be able to evoke the power of food in relationship to the meaning it has in people's lives, but also to the sensual and visceral qualities of what food can be for people. And I was young, and I didn't really know how to make that happen. And so, you know, in my family, you would go to graduate school. And so I decided, okay, I'll get a master's in anthropology because I know anthropology and I could write about people and food. That was what I wanted to do. So I looked and I found 3 graduate programs that were in places that I thought I could also keep working as a chef or a baker. And then I could get a master's degree and I could figure out how to be a food writer. I think I was buying time, as we all know. Like, especially working in food service, you're working 60 hours a week. Like, I couldn't figure it out. So I ended up going to University of Pennsylvania. I knew Philadelphia. I love Philadelphia. And they had a master's and MS in anthropology that I was going to pursue. And then I got there, and from the very day I wrote my first essay to get into the master's program, I was like, I want to study food. And I want to study cooking. I want to understand what about this practice. And I was very focused. Now, as you know, to be very focused on studying cooking as a practice, especially in a cultural setting and in a kind of more liberal arts environment, not in like a hospitality management or other thing, was not typical.
Right.
So it's like 1987, and I remember I just started at Penn, and I just looked at the entire catalog of all courses being offered at the University of Pennsylvania and tried to figure out what electives might be related to food.
Right.
Of which there was, 3. I don't know, 4 maybe. So I started, and I was always against the grain. Like I don't think that my story is really, I can't tell a story that's all about one stepping stone of success to the next stepping stone of success. It was never that way. It was difficult. And I was confident in the sense that I had grown up being raised to be confident about academic work, but I was not actually confident in that I knew I didn't know how to be confident to get what I wanted exactly, but I knew how to try. So that's pretty much how it happened. And then over that year, there was a couple professors associated with University of Pennsylvania, the anthropology department and the South Asia program, who approached me and said, we think you should get a PhD. And I did that. But I said, I only want to do that if I can study food and cooking. And they said, oh yes. But perhaps it was not as, I was more single-minded than they understood. Put it that way.
So were there actual courses on the anthropology of food there, or no?
No. There was a course that I didn't take, which I think is really funny, because I think I got so tired of courses that didn't quite do what I wanted. That was like food, sex, and pollution, and it was like Paul Rosen and Arjun Appadurai.
I see.
But at that point, I was far enough along. I was like, that's not what I want, because as you know, it was so much about the symbolic aspects of food, and I was like, so yeah, I never took a course on it at all.
So were there reading? I mean, was it kind of Douglas Mintz and Goody that you were reading?
Yes. So certainly. Yes. So what I was reading, also Stephen Mennell. I don't know if you read All Manner of Food. Yeah. So very quickly, because I started being very influenced by a history professor in South Asia, David Ludden, who did a lot of work on like food, world food and food politics and hunger. I got into history really quickly. And in fact, I think in many ways, the historical literature was much more helpful to me in graduate school than the anthropological literature, which was a little sparse. I think Carol Cunahan at that point was publishing, and I was reading her work. But because I was interested in the practices, I was always looking for more like action type analysis and not symbol and meaning. So Goody, definitely Jack Goody was great. Mintz was wonderful. And I reached out to him, and I had a little bit of a kind of collegial relationship with him while I was in graduate school. He was very lovely and very supportive.
Right.
And Norbert Elias. So I think I was the everyday life work.
Right.
The historical aspects of the material qualities of everyday life was the work that I found the most influential. And I was also very interested in Raymond Williams, that kind of thing. Yeah.
The cultural Marxist perspective.
Yes, and then I was being trained by South Asianists. So huge amount of training in colonialism, imperialism, nationalism. So a huge amount of my graduate training that was sort of theoretical and conceptual was really in that area.
And so the project that you ended up doing for your PhD, was that also what eventually became the book Haute Cuisine?
Yes, but it was my second dissertation proposal. I went all the way through my oral exams plus my first dissertation proposal to do research in India. And I was going to do a project. I should see if it exists anywhere. This is not a time in history when we were at that point in graduate school. There isn't like a cloud anywhere with this document. But I designed a dissertation proposal to study weddings in India, and in particular catered weddings, and some of the different social differentiations and hierarchies of different types of weddings. And I did initial field work. But what happened was then I applied for the dissertation fellowship grants, and I didn't get any because nobody understood why you would study food and weddings. And I don't know what it was like for you when you were in graduate school, but it was, it's very cohort based. And so I got kind of ripped off away from this cohort that I had gone through I think, 4 years of, difficult training. And when I didn't get the money, and therefore I wasn't going to be able to go to India to do the research, I had a big crisis, and I dropped out of graduate school. And I went to work as a chef in Florida for the season. And I basically had to figure out what I was going to do. And I went down there, and I had a lot of it was related to reading things like historical social cultural context work, which was what I found the most intellectually stimulating for me personally. So traditional ethnography was, I liked reading it, but I didn't really imagine myself in that space, actually. So I started thinking about this time when I was doing field work in India, and I had been going to these different kitchens and interviewing the chefs who were running these kitchens for catered weddings. And I went to a 4-star hotel, which is considered like the highest end place. And the chef took me into the kitchen, and it looked so much like the kitchens I'd worked in. It had all this stainless steel and all this stuff. And then he took me and he said, well, here's my mise en place. And I was reflecting on that. I was like a year later working in a catering kitchen, doing weddings and other things of my own in Florida. And I was like, how can it be that this South Asian person in southern India and me standing here in Florida are literally working in similar physical environments, and we're actually articulating our practice in the same way? And that's why I decided, well, wait a second, maybe what I need to do is figure this out, like how this set of assumptions and values around practices came to be something that was transnational, because of course I was being trained. My advisor was Arjuna Padarai, who was at that time especially, but still, very involved in transnational theory and studies. So I wrote a completely different dissertation proposal. And I think partly because you're doing the interviews, it might be interesting for posterity's sake to say that my advisor said to me, well, okay, you can do this, but I know nothing about this. And your training, again, in anthropology is so place-based. So if you're going to do this kind of work and this topic in Europe, you have to figure out whether or not, I can't tell you if the proposal is ready. So he said, I want you to find 5 people in these fields, and I want you to send them the proposal. And if they say that the proposal is good, then I'll say yes. So I sent the proposal to, you think about it now, and again, I was writing letters, Sidney Mintz, Carol Cunahan, Barbara Wheaton, maybe it was 4, and this woman, Leora Auslander, who Arjun knew. I don't know who the 5th person was. Was there a 5th person? So I sent them it, and then I didn't meet Carol in person, but I went down and drove to Baltimore and met Sidney Mintz. I drove to Boston, met Barbara Wheaton. I drove to New Jersey where Leora Auslander, and I met with them individually.
Wow.
I'm sure this is because Arjun was my advisor, so they were doing him a favor. But I'm thinking about it. I look back on it now, and I'm like, wow, I had a lot of wherewithal that I did that. And they all said, yeah, this is good. So I said, okay, they say it's good. He's like, okay, it's good. You can do it. And that was how it happened. And then I did this completely different project.
Right. So you started with haute cuisine and this kind of historical anthropological perspective on the diffusion of mise en place and other, but you were still focused on practices.
Yes.
And then you moved from there to studying regional cuisine in
Yes.
A Taste of
Yes.
Place. and then in your most recent book, Making Modern Meals, you're still using this kind of historical but also ethnographic perspective to look at domestic, mostly domestic, not exclusively domestic cooking. So was there a trajectory there, do you think?
Yes. So that was the very interesting thing that happened, which I feel in a lot of ways very fortunate that pretty quickly after I made the switch and started doing the dissertation research on French haute cuisine, I realized, because I had been reading, there was a pretty sparse amount of literature on cooking and also cuisine, thinking about it analytically and conceptually in a way that was, I think that was rich. As I said, there's a lot in history I felt that was like, just because it was documenting these everyday practices. So by the time I was finishing my dissertation, I realized that what I wanted to do was 3 projects. I wanted to do haute cuisine, regional cuisine, and domestic cooking. And that really carried me through for because it takes a long time. So it was kind of, what was it? Like a 20-year project that I just went and sort of said, okay, we need to understand each of these separately, and always related to practice and like identity, practice, but also the context and structures within which those elements of cuisine were happening.
So in the course of this 20-year trajectory and these 3 different but interrelated projects and some other projects you've done along the way as well, I feel like you've developed a perspective on both cooking as a practice and here you, along with some of your amazing students, have done some work on the notion of cooking agency, but also tasting as a practice in various work, but especially your work on maple syrup.
Right.
Can you say a little bit about that?
So I think that it is the case that I have been very lucky because cooking and all of the elements around cooking are actually very, very complicated. And so, I think you've also found this in your own experience that, we sort of, for whatever reasons, we ended up saying, this is the set of practices we want to understand. And it's amazing, like how rich it is. Like I really could keep just trying to understand what cooking is as a form of practice, including taste sensory. I include that because I think of it as all the actions around the idea of the products of the natural world that we bring as humans into our lives, and then we transform them so that we can consume them. It's all of the actions, the incredible number of actions that are involved in that are just amazing and complicated. And it's not an overdeveloped field, So you can keep following these different strands. So one of the things that I got very interested in, and because of my own culinary background, and then working at a culinary school and seeing how education has, vocational education for people who want to be trained as professional cooks works, is I started realizing the extent to which there are so many small acts, cognitive acts, manual acts, contextual acts, so many, like an infinite number, that are actually involved in what you would call some form of mastery. But I also came to realize the extent to which, because it's neither, or especially in the past, it's much more culturally valorized now in our culture, cooking as a practice, but it really wasn't back in the day. And also because people have to eat every day, a lot of it's unconscious. So a lot of what I realized was that to teach about it, if it wasn't just about, well, let's analyze the symbolic significance of the matzah, but we actually want to understand how they made the matzah and how they followed the 18-minute rule or whatever it is. It's a set of complicated things that have to happen, that I realized that if I was going to teach about the practices and not just about, let's say, the symbolic significance, I was going to have to make explicit a huge number of learning and expressing and analyzing than had ever really been done in a kind of food and anthropology or food and history seminar setting.
Mm-hmm. And this also raises the question about teaching and pedagogy. And I know that over the last 15 years, you've been doing this course on food anthropology, which is also an immersion of these students in the practice of cooking as part of the course, and starting with, students of, I imagine, various levels of skill, including those who can't distinguish between dill and parsley because they've never had to before.
Yes. So I happen to end up in a department of nutrition and food sciences, and in a lot of ways, that is the department. Nutrition and food sciences are the departments that are still sort of, in a sense, holding as some form of legacy home economics. Mm-hmm. And especially there's a technical or an undergraduate professional major called dietetics, where it's externally accredited by the accrediting body of the dietetics profession, and they have to take a meal preparation course. So these kitchens still exist, but only really, home economics was sort of disbanded in the 70s with the idea that, this was too much associated with women's work, except for in these universities where they were still keeping these dietetics programs going. So I walked in 2006 to a situation where there was this kitchen, which then, for a series of reasons, we got to get a very lovely renovated kitchen 2 years later, which is the one that you've been in. And so I was had been teaching at a culinary school, and I'm like, I'm going to teach in the kitchen. And that has become, in a way, one of my greatest passions. I love teaching through practice. I love teaching about cooking, and I love teaching about writing. Those are my favorite ways to teach. I would leave it to others to teach theoretically driven seminars. It's just not my thing. So I've been doing all this work, which then ended up getting involved in kind of some interdisciplinary research, where we realized that we had developed a very particular pedagogy, a structured means by which we were taking people where they are right now in terms of what they know or don't know about food and cooking and sensory evaluation, and building a structured kind of emergent structural pedagogy, very much inspired by John Dewey's theories of experiential education. And we have created this model that we now use for multiple courses. And we also have trained other people who now use it in their teaching. And increasingly, it's being used by public health and nutrition researchers who are trying to understand how you can empower people to act so that they cook more at home rather than rely on food prepared by others. Mm-hmm. Because generally speaking, food prepared by others tends to be higher in fat, sugars, and salts. So from a health point of view, it can be problematic. Mm-hmm. So it's, that kind of emerged in the middle of finishing doing research on Taste of Place and finishing this ethnographic interview project on domestic cooking. And it just kept going. And it's been very gratifying and remains sort of that's the core of where that work on cooking practice is happening now for me.
I think I had about 3 or 4 questions just shooting off from that, so let me just, maybe some tangential, but I did want to ask you, being in that position, do you have any thoughts on this kind of debate over home economics that I see, the kind of whole series of scholars kind of seeing it as very in oppressive Foucauldian class and race terms, but there was a recent book kind of saying, oh, home economics was great and empowering and all this stuff. I don't know if that was something that you thought about.
You know, I think that we project so much onto what cooking means and what it's supposed to do and who is supposed to do it. It's kind of stunning to me. And so I'm like, you can relitigate all this if you want to, but the truth is we have to figure out how to feed ourselves. It is a dread reality of the human species. It is intrinsic to all human experience. It is both a place of incredible pleasure, but also incredible pain. But underneath that is the fact that you don't know how to do it unless you learn how to do it. So the idea that the assumptions that underpinned the way home economics was taught in the past, of course, we're a different society. We're in a different era in history. Of course it can't be like that. But as someone who has taught literally 1,000 or more students on this set of practices, what people don't know is amazing. Like 20-year-olds who come into and not just 20-year-olds, I mean people I interact with, we have this unbelievable world of choice. We have so many types of food. And here I'm talking about the United States. I'm not talking about other parts of the world. So one of the things that we now have is I have students who come into my class who have eaten many, many different foods, including many different ingredients for which when you put the individual ingredient in front of them, they have no idea what it is. No idea. Just so the arc of it is completely broken up now. And it really always was to a certain extent, because 100 years ago, men weren't cooking unless they were cooking in kitchens. So it was women's knowledge. And also, if you had any money, you had somebody else do that work for you. So it's not like it was totalizing ever. But that's a little bit of this weird nostalgia. I can't quite figure all that out. So my point is just, here we are. If we want to let other people do the cooking for us and have it be purely a professional act, the way like I completely rely on everybody else to take care of my car. Like, what do I know about my car? I know nothing about my car. 1,000 people know more about my car and what to do with my car than I do. And cooking and food could be like that. That's fine. But we need to understand what that means for us as individuals, as a society, and our food system.
Well, that also raises a question for me, because you've been in Vermont for the past 25, 30 years or so. So both at NECI and then at University of Vermont, and just being in Burlington, you've been kind of at the hub of this. You've been at the hub of this food movement that has been trying to challenge at least some of the what many people would see as the wrong turns of the food industry in the U.S. and the way that food has been organized, and then you yourself, along with your husband, have also been producers of food products that you sell at farmers markets. That wonderful, what was it called, ice wine?
Oh yeah, ice cider.
Ice cider, yes, and all of that. You've got that amazing apple orchard that I've been through with how many different varieties?
Yeah, over 100.
Oh my God. So, so I just wondered, kind of, in all of those different roles, has it given you a kind of perspective on where things are going, on the extent, I mean, obviously too crude to say optimistic, pessimistic, but on what might be kind of paths forward. I know you were using this term grassroots postmodernism for a while.
Oh, that was Gustavo Esteva was using that. Yeah, it's a good question. I think I will say the last few years have been so intense in other ways that I haven't been thinking about this in as many conceptual ways. I am an optimistic person, but I'm also a pragmatic person. So I would say my biggest concern is the extent to which food and what we do with it and what it means can be so much the place of unconscious acts and then fantastical thinking. So I just, when I think about what does it mean to say what's the future going to be like, I think the most interesting thing that's happening, I think, is the intersection of thinking about food and our food system and our future in relationship to planetary boundaries. Because I think what we really need, I think, is a more circular approach to how we understand what food is. And if you think of a circular economy or a no food waste approach to food, you have to grapple with the labor issue and the issue of the practices themselves. And I think you and I sort of have this agreement. I've been working on this for 30 years. If we don't fully embrace that this is about a set of practices and it's cognitive actions, it's technical capacities, it's the environments within which people are operating, it's the structures that enable certain forms of practice over other forms of practice. We don't deal with that. We're not really dealing with the system. We're dealing with like a bunch of ideas we have or fantasies we have. One way or the other, either the techno-industrial solution or the kind of small scale, everyone's just going to do it all themselves model. Neither of them are really ever been what's happened, and neither of them are the way that people actually live.
Yeah. Which also brings me back to, since you like to kind of say that you're not doing theory, but maybe it's just a kind of writing more that you object to, that we associate with doing theory, because Because when you talk about these practices and how they relate to these larger structures, I mean, of course, that was the big theoretical question that we were trained on in the 80s,
It's
right?
absolutely true, right? You're right.
So I know you mentioned this project on writing. Do you want to say a little bit about that as well? The project that you've been doing on teaching writing.
Oh, well, that has been really interesting. I am on the editorial collective for Gastronomica, which is the journal. It's now called the Journal for Food Studies, and that journal was so important to me when I first started out. I met Dara Goldstein, who was the founding editor. I think it started in 2000, and I had met her at a conference, and she asked me to write for them, which was so lovely. And I wrote for them a lot, and I loved that writing. It's my favorite kind of writing, which is to be informed analytically, but in a way where you're opening up in a spacious way for people to be able to, think and not sort of didactically kind of tell them things. Anyway, right. So what I've learned over the years is it's my favorite form of writing, and I love to talk to people about writing and their writing. And I really love, I guess I'm a little bit of I have like a therapeutic impulse, which is I want to get graduate students and young scholars to rip off their shackles when it comes to writing and figure out that they can write in ways that are accessible and interesting, but also say something of significance. Mm-hmm. So last semester I taught a 1 credit, I got some money from the Humanities Institute at UVM, and I taught a 1 credit food writing course specifically to have the students write pieces to submit to Gastronomica, creative nonfiction, short pieces. So much fun. And then 2 other of the collective members were able to come at the end of April, and we had like an intense workshop, and then we all went out to dinner, and we were all able just talking about writing, and I love that. I love seeing people have a realization about what they're doing and what's holding them back.
Great.
Yeah.
So thinking about your interest in writing and what you told me about kind of some of your early inspirations like MFK Fisher, it kind of ties to me with your interest in studying sensory aspects of food, and your work has certainly been very aware that taste isn't the only way we sense, but that it's that food is always multimodal, as they call it, or multisensory, synesthetic. So I wonder if your work on the sensory aspects of food also kind of helped you think about writing about food.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think so. I think that I'm very interested in how we can evoke through writing all of these components of the way that food operates in the human experience, and to understand that it's both extremely visceral and very specific and kind of sensual, but also can tell us about the way the entire world works. So it's that quality of food that I think has just still enthralls me, literally 40 more years later. And I have been doing other things, and But one of my goals over the next couple of years is to go back to or reconnect with some of the ways I really liked to write the best over the course of my career, but also the writing of people like MFK Fisher and even Wendell Berry and other people who wrote short kind of vignette type or very specific pieces, but in so doing made you think about a lot or everything or love or loss or, colonialism or whatever. And so I've been thinking, I'm working on it in a very slow way. I want to write a book called The Foods I Will Never Taste. And a lot of what I want to work through is I've been very interested in the fact that a lot of what we've been able to do with our food system, and it really does begin with colonialism, even with, like over 500 years, we've been able to create for some people more and more expansiveness in relationship to food. More choices, theoretically, more choices, more calories, more locations where you can get it, more this, more that. But as we are in a moment in history where we're thinking about all of the inequities and all the problems of the way that system has been structured, and we're thinking about planetary boundaries and climate change, I've been really thinking, what about constraint? How do we understand the possibility that the future of food is a future where we actually actively constrain ourselves? And yet, how do we also then still have like all the sensory amazing qualities of what food can be? So one of the very specific examples I have is I went to Madagascar on a trip with two people, and it was a very intense and amazing experience. And it was to look at this particular wild pepper vine that's conservation groups and development groups are trying to get small farmers who live on the borders of conserved areas to think about harvesting as a way to make money so that they don't do slash and burn agriculture, which is, so much of Madagascar has become deforested. But I spent a week with different people who were involved with this sapere pepper, and I left Madagascar and I said, I should never taste that again. I should never have access to that pepper, because the reasons I would have access to that pepper are all the reasons that we have like a broken food system. And so that's like in my mind. And then I've been thinking of maybe I will talk to people who I think should taste certain things, even if I shouldn't taste them. Like some, eating whales in certain parts of the world, and talk to them about the whale, but I don't eat the whale. Just find out how, anyway, does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I guess the first time I think maybe people started to think about this broadly was back in the late 80s, early 90s with Rainforest Crunch and that fiasco.
Yes. So that is, I'm starting to think about that as what would it look like if I thought about it, but what would it look like, especially anthropologists, I think, and historians could think about constraint in really interesting ways. Not oppression exactly, like agency, right? We've been so focused on agency, and I've done so much work on agency, but is it a form of agency to act with constraint? So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. For me, working in Kalimnos, it was always fascinating the kind of ways that people put such an emphasis on the sensory experience of food that was in fact very constrained. and was very familiar, but to them was different enough to require comment and thought and all of those things, which I think we seem to have lost.
Yeah, and we are moving the Foods Lab. One of the things we've been working on in the Foods Lab, which is the space where I do the teaching, is we've been spending the summer figuring out all the ways that we are going to move our practices towards what we would call sustainable practices in relationship particularly to issues of climate change and industrialization of the food system. So we've created like these axioms and of different ways that we're going to do things that are, that are related to lower food waste, more local purchasing, and some other things. And one of the ways we're doing it is we are just jettisoning a lot of ingredients because then we're like one-off buying like one kind of herb or something. And I was like, no, they're going to use parsley 6 times. We're going to buy 100-pound bags of potatoes, and they're going to cook potatoes 6 different ways. We're not going to give them sweet potatoes and this thing and that thing. And in a way, it's like a total change from when I started teaching it with food and culture, where I was trying to give them the opportunity to taste all these different things. Now I'm like, nope, you are just going to learn how to taste really deeply a smaller set, because it's somehow, to me, something we really got to figure out.
Right. Yeah, that sounds amazing. One of these days, I am going to come and do an ethnography.
I know, you should. It would be very
class.
fun. I know, it would be really fun.
So, one other question about, as you said, you've been working in this food and nutrition department, and so not in anthropology directly, at least institutionally, and that's kind of opened you up to kind of alternative, at least from anthropology's perspective, at least from cultural anthropology, mainstream methods.
Yeah.
So I feel like you see some value in combining qualitative and quantitative methods, as well as kind of exploring methods like the video, which we both have found so tremendously revealing.
Yeah. I'm old enough now that I'm perfectly comfortable with cultural anthropologists dismissing my methodological approaches. It will be of no great sadness to me if that is what's happening or what happens. I love the anthropological stance. I love the trying to figure out the whole from the parts. I love talking to people and eliciting from them, asking good enough questions that you elicit their assumptions in ways that they don't even realize that they had in the first place. I love all of that. But I was not in a situation where I was going to be able to do long-term ethnographic research, given just the circumstances of my employment. And it's been really interesting, and I've learned a ton. And I really like working with people who are trained in other disciplines. I never like reductionism. Like, that is the anthropological axiom that I just can't. I really struggle when I'm working closely with somebody who wants a black and white result, who wants a black and white answer. Like, I don't go for that. But working with the team to try to understand a form of complexity of human life or human behavior, and to get at that from whatever tools might help you figure that out, I'm like, yeah, why not? Why wouldn't we use that? It's just like thinking about medicine. You wouldn't just only use one diagnostic tool if you have 8 diagnostic tools. Like, I mean, you could, but most people I know don't do that. So the big thing I do when I work with teams is I'm always like, A, don't assume you know how people operate. Mm-hmm. Let people have agency over explaining to you in whatever way they're explaining to you their own thoughts and perceptions, and don't oversimplify or reduce the means by which you get that information. So, like, it's boring to some of the people I work with, but I'll be like, no, you can't do that. We can't just do a statistical analysis on this. What's another way we're going to get at this question that allows us to see it with more complexity? Mm-hmm. So I really do think of myself as trained as an anthropologist, even if I have never done solely ethnographic research and using the ethnography or ethnographic participant observation as my main methodology.
Yeah, although of course as I think we both learned with the videos, that's like a super thick description of like all the things going on.
I think I told you this, but I have in that material culture book that I think you also are getting a piece in, I do this description of one person's kitchen. Mm-hmm. No, maybe two or three kitchens from those videos. It's like, oh my God, the level of detail that I could get to because I had it captured on video. So much fun. Mm-hmm. So much fun.
Right. So I feel like both being at UVM in one of the really few food studies programs in the country that's really top notch, and also working as editor at Gastronomica. You've been president of Society for Anthropology of Food and Nutrition, or vice president?
Vice president. Okay. Never president.
Do you have a sense of kind of the directions that food anthropology is going in?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I feel as if the quickest answer is no. Because I think there's a lot that has to be figured out about what is research about food, what should research about food look like in general in the future? And then what would an anthropology of food do for that, you know?
So you think like addressing climate change, for example?
I think I'm really interested in how do we bring new voices into the conversation. And to do that with justice, I think we have to let go of a lot of the ways we were trained and we were disciplined into, again, as we know, one of the great bugaboos of an academic life is this idea of rigor and standards. And so I'm like, what should all this look like in the future? Even what's going to happen to the scholarly monograph? What should happen to the scholarly monograph, honestly? So I guess I'm really interested in allowing for a huge amount of turmoil and ferment, and not really having a sense of what's next. Because then, especially if you're perceived of as being a senior person, you can create this kind of gatekeeping situation, which is I'm not interested, because I was never really I wasn't ever centrally doing what was done. So I'm like, I don't know, do whatever you think. But as to point out, as you know, my bugaboo is jargon. Like, I want good, clear writing that's provocative and makes you have some insight. That's my main thing that should happen. Any anthropology, but food anthropology should definitely have that quality. Also because other people are interested in it. So let's write so other people will read it. Because that's something that other forms of anthropology may not get anybody who would read it.
That's right.
Otherwise, so, yeah.
Ferment, that's a good metaphor in our microbiome times.
Exactly.
Well, this has been really delightful, Amy. I'm really glad we've had a chance to.
So fun.
And so thanks very much for coming all this way to New York and to joining our interview today.
Thanks so much. I couldn't have done it without you.